43. Forced heirship in Louisiana. Louisiana, with its French legal heritage, has forced heirship laws that restrict how married people can distribute their estates. You can't completely disinherit your children under a certain age, 24, or with disabilities. Even your will is subject to these rules. This means your marriage and subsequent children create mandatory inheritance obligations that you cannot contract around. It's the only state where having kids creates ironclad legal claims on your estate that you're legally prohibited from breaking, making marriage and children a package deal with automatic financial consequences. Korea's family register system, Hoju. Until 2008, South Korea used the Hoju system, where families were registered under the male head of household. When a woman married, she was removed from her father's register and added to her husband's, but not as an equal, as a member under his headship. Women couldn't even be the legal head of their own household. Korea finally abolished this, but for generations, marriage legally erased a woman's independent family identity. It's the only modern system that treated marriage like a corporate acquisition, where the wife was transferred assets. Shotgun marriage, actual legal practice. The term shotgun wedding comes from actual American legal and social practice, 1800s, 1900s, where a father would literally threaten a man with a shotgun to force him to marry his daughter if she got pregnant. While not formally codified, this was legally tolerated and socially enforced. Courts would even look favorably on marriages performed under duress, if the duress was from a father protecting his daughter's honor. It's the only legalish system where threatening someone with a firearm to force them into marriage was considered good parenting. Medieval Germanic Mundoald under medieval Germanic law. A woman was always under the Mundoald, guardianship of a man. First her father, then her husband. When she married, her father literally gave his Mundoald to the groom during the ceremony. The woman wasn't a party to the transaction. She was the object being transferred. This legal guardianship meant she couldn't own property, enter contracts, or make legal decisions without male permission. It's the only legal system that treated marriage as a literal change in ownership of an adult human being. Hawaii's cousin, Marriage Permission Hawaii, allows first cousins to marry, but with a weird requirement. They need genetic counseling first. The state's position is, we're not going to stop you, but you need to sit in a room with a geneticist who will explain exactly why this might be a terrible idea. It's legal permission, with a side of scientific judgment. It's the only state that treats cousin marriage like a medical procedure, requiring informed consent and a professional intervention. Ancient Roman usus, marriage in ancient Rome. There was a form of marriage called usus, where if a woman lived with a man continuously for 1 year, she automatically became his wife. But if she spent 3 consecutive nights away from his house each year, the marriage clock reset to 0. Women who wanted to avoid marriage would take an annual 3-night vacation. It's the only legal system where marriage was a default setting that could be prevented by a long weekend away from home, like a subscription service you had to actively cancel. Massachusetts's anti-fornication law in Massachusetts. Until 2012, it was illegal for unmarried people to have sex. The law made fornication, consensual sex between unmarried people, a crime punishable by up to 3 months in jail and a $30 fine. While rarely enforced in modern times, it remained on the books for over 200 years. The state's official position was that sex was a marital privilege, and doing it outside marriage was a criminal act. It's the only state in recent history where your relationship status determined whether your private life was legal or a misdemeanor. Alright, we've covered 49 marriage laws that range from bizarre to absolutely bonkers. But before we get to our final number, it's time for the final verdict. In our opinion, the award for the most mind-blowing marriage law from today's list goes to number 33, the Philippines' complete divorce ban. Why? Because while most of these laws are historical curiosities or local oddities, this one affects millions of people right now today. In a nation of over 100 million people, there is no legal escape from a failed marriage except expensive annulment. It's the ultimate example of a government treating marriage as a permanent contract with no exit clause, regardless of abuse, abandonment, Louisiana's covenant marriage. Louisiana offers covenant marriage, a legally stricter form of marriage that's harder to dissolve. Couples must undergo premarital counseling, and divorce is only allowed for specific reasons: abuse, adultery, felony, imprisonment, enlightenment. Regular marriage still exists as an option. This is an upgrade to more restrictions. It's the only state that offers marriage difficulty settings: regular mode, standard divorce laws, or hard mode, covenant marriage where leaving requires proving fault. Imagine choosing to make your own marriage legally harder to escape, like a relationship escape room you can't leave. Ancient Sparta's anti-bachelor tax Spartans who remained unmarried past a certain age faced severe social and legal penalties. They couldn't attend certain public festivals, were subjected to ritual humiliation by young women, and were denied the honor burial given to married men. The law didn't just encourage marriage, it weaponized social shame against bachelors. It's the ancient version of your family asking, "When are you getting married?" Except it's written into law and comes with public humiliation ceremonies. Philippines' divorce prohibition. The Philippines and Vatican City are the only places in the world where divorce is completely illegal. Annulment exists, but requires proving the marriage was invalid from the start. It's expensive, averaging $1,000 to $3,000 to $10,000. Time-consuming, 2 to 10 years, and requires evidence like psychological incapacity. Most Filipinos can't afford it, so millions are trapped in failed marriages with no legal exit. It's the only country where "till death do us part" isn't a vow. It's a legally enforced life sentence with no possibility of parole. Ancient Greek Athenian heiress law in Athens: if a man died with only daughters and no sons, his daughter became an epikleros, heiress. Here's the weird part. She was required to marry her closest male relative on her father's side, usually her uncle or cousin. Even if she was already married, that marriage could be dissolved to marry her to the relative who would inherit through her. She wasn't inheriting property, she was the property being inherited. The law treated women as human transfer mechanisms for real estate. Kentucky's surprise marriage law in Kentucky: a woman technically cannot appear in a bathing suit on a highway unless she's either A, escorted by at least 2 police officers, or B, carrying a club. What does this have to do with marriage? Absolutely nothing, but it's the same state that limits remarrying the same person to 3 times. So clearly, Kentucky has very specific ideas about women, highways, and appropriate protective measures. It's the only state where your beach attire requires either law enforcement or weaponry. Hindu Marriage Act's Sapinda prohibition under Hindu law in India. You cannot marry anyone within your Sapinda relationship. Basically, anyone who shares a common ancestor within 3 generations on the mother's side, or 5 on the father's side. The law requires people to literally trace their family tree before getting married to ensure they're not accidentally marrying a third cousin twice removed. It's the only legal system where your wedding planning includes mandatory genealogical research that would make Ancestry.com jealous. Revolutionary France's divorce by incompatibility. During the French Revolution, or 1792-1803, France had the most liberal divorce laws in history. Couples could divorce by mutual consent for literally any reason, including incompatibility of temperament. No proof needed, no fault required, just "we don't get along," and you were done. This lasted only 11 years before Napoleon shut it down, but for a brief moment, revolutionary France was more progressive on divorce than most countries are today. It's the only period in history where "he chews too loud" was a legally sufficient reason to dissolve a marriage. Ottoman Empire's coffee deprivation, divorce under Ottoman law. A woman had legitimate grounds for divorce if her husband failed to provide her with sufficient coffee. This wasn't about caffeine addiction. Coffee was a social and cultural necessity. A husband's failure to provide it was considered neglect of marital duties. It's the only legal system in history where your morning beverage was a constitutional right within marriage, and withholding it was grounds for legal separation. Imagine the court case. "Your Honor, he only bought me decaf." Arkansas's verbal abuse. Exception Arkansas is one of the few states that recognizes indignities as grounds for fault-based divorce. This is legalese for verbal abuse, humiliation, and contemptuous treatment. But here's the catch. You have to prove a pattern of behavior that makes living together intolerable. One nasty comment doesn't count. The court needs evidence that your spouse has made your life legally intolerable. It's the only legal system where you need to document and prove that your spouse is consistently awful, as if you're building a case study for a terrible person. Ancient Hebrew get divorce document. In Orthodox Judaism, a husband must give his wife a get divorce document for the divorce to be religiously valid. If he refuses, she remains a guna, chained woman, unable to remarry within the faith. Some men use this as leverage, extorting money or custody concessions. Israel has created special rabbinic courts and even imprisonment powers to force recalcitrant husbands to give the get. But the problem persists. It's the only religious legal system where one spouse can hold the other hostage to a marriage indefinitely, and the community has to legally force their hand. Victorian England's restitution of conjugal rights. In Victorian England, if a spouse left the marital home, the abandoned spouse could get a court order for restitution of conjugal rights. Literally, a court order demanding your spouse come home and resume marital duties, including sex. If they refused, they could be held in contempt. The UK didn't abolish this until 1970. Imagine a court ordering someone to have sex with their spouse under threat of legal penalty. It's the only legal system that treated spousal intimacy as a contractually enforceable obligation with judicial remedies. Wyoming's women's rights pioneer Status Wyoming was the first U.S. territory to grant women the right to vote, 1869, and hold office. But here's the weird marriage law. When Wyoming was trying to become a state, Congress told them they'd have to revoke women's voting rights. Wyoming's response, "We'll stay a territory." They literally chose to delay statehood, rather than take rights away from women. When they finally became a state in 1890, women kept their rights. It's the only state that valued women's equality enough to tell Congress to shove it, which indirectly affected marriage because married women could actually own Nebraska's STD disclosure requirement. Nebraska, it's illegal to marry someone if you have a venereal disease without disclosing it. But unlike other states that just require testing, Nebraska puts the burden on individual disclosure. This means you're supposed to have a pre-proposal conversation that goes, "Before I ask you to spend forever with me, I need to inform you of my complete sexual health history, as required by state statute." Nothing says romance like legally mandated medical disclosure. It's the only state where your marriage proposal might require a PowerPoint presentation with lab results. Ancient Roman confarreatio, the most elite form of marriage in ancient Rome, was called confarreatio, reserved for patricians and required for certain priesthoods. The ceremony involved the couple sharing a cake made of spelt, a type of wheat, in front of 10 witnesses and the Pontifex Maximus, high priest. But here's the insane part. This form of marriage was nearly impossible to dissolve. Divorce required a reverse ceremony called diffariatio that was so complicated and religiously intense that most people just stayed miserably married. It's the only legal system where your choice of wedding cake determined whether you could ever get divorced. South Carolina's seduction law in South Carolina. Until 1991, there was a law against seduction under promise of marriage. If a man promised to marry a woman to convince her to have sex, then didn't marry her, she could sue him. But it gets weirder. The law specifically only protected virtuous unmarried women, meaning the court had to somehow legally determine her virtue level before she could even bring the case. It's the only legal system that required a virginity character reference as part of litigation. China's bride price inflation. In China, the tradition of bride price, betrothal gifts from groom to bride's family, has become so financially extreme that it's created a legal and social crisis. In some regions, families demand apartments, cars, and cash gifts totaling 1,000, 50,000, 100,000 plus. Local governments have actually had to step in and publish suggested maximum bride prices to prevent families from bankrupting themselves. It's not legally enforceable, but it's the only country where the government publishes price guidelines for getting married, like it's a consumer protection issue. Mesopotamian Code of Hammurabi, 129. The Code of Hammurabi, circa 1750 BCE, had a fascinatingly specific law. If a married woman was caught in adultery, both she and her lover would be tied together and thrown into the river. However, if the husband forgave his wife, the king would forgive the lover. Your survival literally depended on your boyfriend's wife's husband's mercy and the king's mood. It's the only legal system where adultery was punishable by synchronized drowning with a royal pardon option. Minnesota's mental state marriage. Minnesota has a law stating you cannot get married if you're under the influence of alcohol or drugs. But here's the problem. There's no breathalyzer at the courthouse. No sobriety test. It's entirely subjective. If the officiant thinks you seem drunk, they can refuse to marry you. This has led to couples being denied marriage licenses because they were too happy, too giddy, or too excited. Emotions that apparently look identical to intoxication. It's the only state where being too enthusiastic about getting married can legally disqualify you from getting married. Ancient Ireland's trial, marriage under ancient Brehon law in Ireland. There was a form of trial marriage called hand fasting that lasted 1 year and 1 day. At the end of that period, if either party wanted out, they could walk away with no consequences. Any children born during that time were still legitimate. It was essentially marriage with a money-back guarantee. The medieval Irish created the world's first try before you buy marital system, where commitment came with a 12-month return policy, no questions asked. Texas's common law. Confusion: Texas recognizes common law marriage, but the requirements create absolute chaos. You must 1. Agree to be married, 2. Live together in Texas, and 3. Represent to others that you're married. But here's where it gets legally murky. There's no time requirement. You could introduce someone as your wife at a party as a joke, live together for 2 months, and boom, legally married. Meanwhile, couples who've lived together for 20 years but always said partner might not be married at all. It's the only state where your vocabulary choices at social gatherings can accidentally create legally binding contracts. Islamic triple talaq being banned. In traditional Islamic law, now banned in many countries, a man could divorce his wife by saying, "Talaq, I divorce you," 3 times. That's it. No court, no paperwork, no division of assets. Just 3 words. In the age of smartphones, this created an absurd problem. Men were divorcing their wives via text message, WhatsApp, and even Skype. Courts in India, Pakistan, and other countries had to deal with cases like, "He sent me 3 divorce emojis. Are we legally divorced?" India finally banned instant triple talaq in 2019, making it the only country that had to specifically legislate against divorce by text. Medieval Europe's clandestine marriage crisis before the Council of Trent, 1563. All you needed to get married in medieval Europe was mutual consent. No witnesses, no church, no documentation, just 2 people saying, "I marry you," to each other. Sounds romantic until you realize this created massive legal chaos. People would claim marriages that never happened, deny marriages that did, and there was no way to prove anything. The church finally stepped in and said, "Okay, from now on, you need witnesses, a priest, and it has to happen in a church." Medieval Europe is the only society that had to create marriage bureaucracy because people couldn't be trusted to remember Sparta's marriage deception. We talked about Spartan marriage kidnapping, but here's another layer. After the abduction, the bride's head was shaved and she was dressed in men's clothing. The theory? It made the transition easier for men who had spent their entire lives in all-male military barracks. Spartan law essentially acknowledged that their warriors were so conditioned to male companionship that they needed their wives to cosplay as men on the wedding night. It's the only legal system in history that treated heterosexual marriage as something that required a gradual adjustment period with gender-bending costumes. Massachusetts's mental capacity test in Massachusetts. Until recently, you could be denied a marriage license if you were deemed to be mentally incompetent. But here's the absurd part. The definition of incompetence was incredibly vague and often arbitrary. Who decided? Sometimes a judge, sometimes a family member, sometimes just a clerk who didn't like the look of you. There's no standardized test, no psychological evaluation, just someone's opinion about whether you seemed smart enough to understand marriage. It's the only contract in America where you might need to pass a vibes-based intelligence check administered by a bureaucrat having a bad day. Islamic mut'ah, temporary marriage. In Shia Islam, there's a form of marriage called mut'ah, or temporary marriage. Unlike regular marriage, this one comes with an expiration date. You negotiate the length. Could be an hour, a day, a month, or years. And when the time's up, the marriage automatically dissolves. No divorce needed. It's marriage with a built-in sunset clause. Imagine signing your wedding vows with a countdown timer. I take you as my lawfully wedded spouse for the next 72 hours. It's the only marital institution that functions like a rental agreement. Delaware's anti-dare law. Remember we mentioned you can't get married on a dare in Delaware? Here's why this is brilliant. At some point, a judge had to sit in a courtroom and listen to someone say, "Your Honor, I only married him because my fraternity brothers bet me $50 I wouldn't." And instead of just annulling that one marriage, the Delaware legislature said, "This is clearly a pattern. We need legislation." They created a law specifically to prevent drunk decisions from becoming legally binding lifetime commitments. It's the state's official position that hold my beer is not a valid foundation for matrimony. Saudi Arabia's guardian permission. In Saudi Arabia, until very recently, a woman of any age needed permission from a male guardian to get married. This wasn't just for minors. A 40-year-old woman with a PhD and a successful career still needed her father, brother, or even her own son to sign off on her marriage. The reforms of 2019 loosened some restrictions, but the guardian system still exists in modified form. It's a legal framework that treats grown women like permanent minors in a perpetual state of needing permission slips from the men in their lives. New York's marriage after midnight in New York. Marriages performed after midnight are technically invalid unless performed by a member of the clergy. If a judge or city clerk marries you at 12:01 a.m., legally, it doesn't count. This creates a Cinderella-style deadline for civil ceremonies. Imagine your wedding running late, and at 11:58 p.m. the officiant starts speed reading the vows like an auctioneer, because if the clock strikes 12, your marriage turns into a pumpkin. It's the only legal system that treats midnight like a contractual force field. Ancient Athens's citizenship breeding program in ancient Athens. Under laws established by Pericles, both parents had to be Athenian citizens for their children to inherit citizenship. This wasn't just bureaucracy, it was social engineering. Marriage to a foreigner was legally valid, but your kids would be permanently excluded from political life. Athens essentially created a law that said, marry whoever you want, but if you want your children to matter, you better marry one of us. It's the ancient version of an HOA covenant, but for your entire bloodline. 8. Montana's proxy. Marriage Montana allows double proxy marriage, meaning neither party has to be present at their own wedding. This was originally created for military service members deployed overseas, which is actually thoughtful, but the law doesn't limit it to military, anyone can do it. Theoretically, two people could get married in Montana while one is in Tokyo and the other is in London, and they could have never met in person. It's the only state where your wedding can happen without you, like a really important dentist appointment you sent someone else to. 9. Ancient Hebrew levirate marriage. We mentioned this before, but let's go deeper. Under biblical law, Deuteronomy 25:5-10, if your brother died childless, you were required to marry his widow. Refusing meant public humiliation. The widow would remove your sandal in front of the town elders and spit in your face, and your family would forever be known as the house of the unsandaled. So your options were marry your brother's widow or be permanently branded as that guy who got spat on. For refusing his marital duty, it's the only legal system where footwear removal was part of a shame ritual. So France's presidential permission for posthumous marriage. France allows you to marry a dead person, but only with permission from the president of France. The requirements are intense. You must prove you were planning to marry before they died. There must be grave reasons, and you must gather extensive documentation. But here's the strangest part. The marriage is backdated to the day before the person died. Legally, you're married, but the marriage immediately ended with their death. So you're simultaneously married and widowed in the same ceremony. It's the only wedding where, until death do us part, the sacred union of two souls. A timeless institution built on love, trust, and commitment. At least, that's what the greeting cards tell you. But when governments decide to regulate matrimony, something strange happens. Logic takes a vacation. Common sense files for divorce. And what emerges is a legal landscape so bizarre, so utterly ridiculous, that you'll wonder if lawmakers were drunk on wedding champagne when they wrote these rules. For centuries, societies around the world have attempted to legislate love, control courtship, and dictate the terms of "till death do us part." The result? A global catalogue of marital madness that proves one undeniable truth. The only thing more unpredictable than marriage itself is humanity's attempt to create laws about it. Today, we're diving deep into 50 of the most absurd, hilarious, and jaw-droppingly real marriage laws ever created. From ancient Rome to modern America, from wedding nights to divorce courts, these are the rules that make you grateful you didn't get married in the wrong place at the wrong time. Buckle up. This matrimonial journey is about to get weird. Kentucky's show and tell requirement. In Kentucky, a woman cannot legally remarry the same man more than 3 times. That's right. The state has officially put a limit on how many times you can decide, maybe it'll work this time. After 3 marriages to the same person, the government steps in and says, "We've seen this movie before, and the ending doesn't change." It's the legal equivalent of your friends staging an intervention, except it's written into state law. Imagine the conversation at the courthouse. "Ma'am, we see here you've already divorced and remarried Brad twice. 1 more time, and you're legally required to find a new Brad." 2. Ancient Babylon's bride. Auction in ancient Babylon. Under the Code of Hammurabi, there was an annual bride auction. But here's the twist. It wasn't just about selling women to the highest bidder. The system was bizarrely progressive for its time. The most beautiful women were auctioned first, and the money collected was used as dowries for women considered less attractive, ensuring everyone could get married. It was essentially a redistribution of wealth program, except the currency was matrimony, and the stock exchange was a public marketplace where your father literally sold you to strangers. It's the only economic system in history where your market value directly determined someone else's wedding budget. Switzerland's naked neighbors. Policy in Switzerland, there's no specific law against getting married naked, but there is a law that makes it illegal to flush your toilet after 10 p.m. in an apartment building because it might disturb the neighbors. So technically, you could have a completely nude wedding ceremony at 9:30 p.m., but God forbid you flush the toilet during the reception. The Swiss have decided that matrimonial nudity is fine, but late-night plumbing is where they draw the line. It's a country that has its priorities very specifically calibrated. Medieval Europe's consummation witnesses throughout medieval Europe, particularly among nobility. It wasn't enough to just get married. You had to prove it. The solution: consummation witnesses. After the wedding ceremony, a group of nobles, clergy, and family members would escort the newlyweds to their bedchamber, sometimes staying in the room or just outside the door to verify that the marriage was completed. In some cases, they'd wait for the groom to emerge with the bedsheet as proof. This wasn't considered invasive. It was considered essential legal documentation. It's the only time in history where your wedding night came with an audience and a notary public. Hong Kong's cheating clause. In Hong Kong, a married woman who commits adultery can be prosecuted, but there's a legal loophole you won't believe. If her husband has sex with the adulteress in the matrimonial bed, he's also breaking the law for permitting adultery in the matrimonial home. So let me get this straight. She cheats, that's illegal. He finds out and confronts the situation in the worst possible way, also illegal. It's a law that somehow manages to criminalize both the affair and the weirdest possible response to discovering one. The only winning move is to hire a lawyer before you hire a private investigator. The Roman marriage by capture. Ancient Rome had a form of marriage called marriage by capture, matrimonium per coemptionem, where a man would symbolically purchase his bride from her father. But here's where it gets weird. This wasn't just symbolic. There was an actual price negotiation, a contract, and a formal transfer of property, except the property was a human being. The bride would then perform a ritual where she'd resist being taken to her new home, even though everyone involved had already signed the paperwork. It was the world's first example of contractual theater, where everyone was acting out a kidnapping that had been formally notarized 3 weeks earlier. UAE's genetic compatibility test in the United Arab Emirates. You cannot get a marriage license without first undergoing mandatory genetic testing for inherited blood disorders like sickle cell anemia and thalassemia. The results don't legally prevent you from marrying, but you're required to receive genetic counseling if there's a compatibility issue. It's the government's way of saying, we're not going to stop you from making this decision, but we are going to make absolutely sure you understand the genetic consequences first. IRCs. It's like a terms and conditions agreement, but for your DNA. Victorian England's widow waiting period. In Victorian England, a widow was legally required to wait a full year before remarrying. This wasn't out of respect for the deceased. It was to avoid confusion about paternity. If she happened to be pregnant, the state needed to know whether the child belonged to her husband number 1 or husband number 2 for inheritance purposes. A woman's grief was less important than the legal clarity of her uterus. It's the only mourning period in history that doubled as a government-mandated pregnancy test. 9. Japan's asymmetric waiting period. Speaking of waiting periods, Japan had a law until 2016 that required women to wait 6 months after divorce before remarrying, while men could remarry immediately. The stated reason? Same as Victorian England: paternity clarity. But here's the kicker. This was the 21st century. We have DNA tests. We have medical records. We have smartphones that can identify your face in a crowd. But apparently, the Japanese legal system decided that making women wait half a year was easier than just doing a paternity test. It took until 2016 to reduce this to 100 days, which is still longer than it takes to binge-watch every season of your favorite show twice. 10. Finland's wife-carrying championship. Okay, this isn't technically a marriage law, but Finland holds an official wife-carrying world championship. And here's the legal part. The prize used to be the wife's weight in beer. The event has become so institutionalized that it has official rules, international participants, and government recognition. Finland has managed to create a legally sanctioned sporting event where the objective is to treat your spouse like a sack of potatoes over an obstacle course, and your reward is measured in alcohol. It's the only marriage tradition where your spouse's weight directly correlates to your celebration capacity.